Rishon, first. Bekol Zeman Rishon, and always. Ani noten kavod, Shabbat, ve'halel, le'el Yom, the Most High God. Elohei ha'Elohim, God of God. Adonai ha'Adonim, Lord of Lords. Melachei ha'Melachim, King of Kings. Eloheinu Avoteinu, the God of our ancestors. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Elohei Imotenu, of our mothers, Sarah, Rachel, Leah, Rebecca, Deborah, Ruth, Naomi, Adasa, they're called Imohot Yisrael. Gamani Kavod, Le Rosh Haravi, Chief Rabbi Capron Shul Foneo, who's in New York and up in Poughkeepsie today. We wish him well on his speaking engagement with that congregation. To Rabbi Benjamin Levy, Rabbi Baruch Yehuda was here last Shabbat, and especially Zakein Azriel, to Shalomo Al-Gabai, to Rabbi Deborah Levy, who we missed today, but we keep it in our prayers. Bani Uvorot Yisrael, Shabbat Shalom, and Shalom Aleichem. Indeed, let me begin. My sermon today is called The Judgments of God. And for those of you who have been studying the Torah passages with us each week, last week you read the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus. And this is one of the most special passages in the Torah because it contains what many people call the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments. And so that passage, those two tablets, this part of the Torah is very special. We call it the Commandments. But this week's Sidra is not called the Commandments. It is called Mishpatim. Mishpatim, the judgments. And what I'm going to explain today or show you is how God gives us many, many commandments. And the judgments of God are contained in how we understand and how we apply these commandments. And we get a lesson that God is trying to teach mankind using the children of Israel as an example. And so we're happy and proud that it is about us and it's our ancestors. But the lessons are universal. And I'll also argue today that the lessons are timeless, especially relevant to our society today. So let me begin, as I so often do. In the book of Deuteronomy, it says, Ha'azinu hashamayim va'adabera. Give ear, O heaven, and I will speak, and the earth will hear the words of my mouth. May my teaching fall like rain, my words like dew, upon the gentle and tender grass. For I will proclaim the name of the Lord and ascribe greatness unto our God. That little prayer by Moses is my wish at the beginning of every sermon. I pray that the people will be like grass, that they will be thirsty for knowledge. And that something I say about the Torah today will help you to grow, will nourish you, will make you stronger. And so, whether you pay attention or whether you fall asleep, heaven and earth will bear witness. I got a witness today. Heaven and earth will bear witness that I did come and I proclaimed the name of the Lord, whether the people heard or not. And so with that, let us start in the book of Exodus, the 21st chapter, and we'll start at the first verse, and then I have some passages that I want to pick. But let me set the context again. And what's so interesting about all of these laws, the commandments, and the judgments here, it is given while we are still on our journey out of the land of Egypt, but long before we made it to Israel. It is given to a generation of people who were all slaves in Egypt. They were not the descendants of slaves. They were the slaves. And they were with Moses. as he brought them out. This simple little fact is so easy to overlook. It's so important when we read what the judgment is. In the 21st chapter, the first verse, there it says, Shabath Mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. And these are the judgments that he put before them. I like this kind of presenting it as opposed to just simply commanding it. You know, in 20th chapter, you commanded you this. I'm just going to put this in front of you for you to think about. And it says, ki. It's almost a pun. Ki in Hebrew means if, kind of. You have to have ki. But ki, tikne evet. If you buy a slave. Ivri. Hebrew is the language, right? And so it says, Ivri, a Hebrew slave or servant. Now my translation has servant. There's really no difference in word between a servant and a slave. In Hebrew, it's the same word, coming from the verb avod, means to work. It also means to serve. So when Hashem says, Lo ta'avod, you should not do any work, but then it says, you shall not serve any other gods. Either. Same word, to work, to serve. To serve another man, to serve the Most High, and the avod is the work, the action involved in that. And he says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th year he shall go free for nothing. Right? He doesn't have to buy his freedom, doesn't have to pay for it. But if you have a Hebrew slave, he can work for you for a maximum of 7 years. And at the end of that time, you must let him go free for nothing. So, what do we observe here? A people who are themselves slaves, and God is telling them, if one day you become the master of slaves, why would a people, and we'll see in this passage, who were themselves slaves ever want to own slaves? Why doesn't the Torah say slavery shall forever be prohibited? People who just got out of slavery, the first thing you would think they want to do is to abolish slavery. But yet the Torah kind of institutes it with limitations and with rules that either distinguish it from other forms of slavery, that humanize it. But even with this, it says only a Hebrew slave. We'll make a distinction between what if you have a slave who's not a Hebrew? Do you have to let that person go at the end of 7 years? No. But it says the Hebrew slave, you got to treat them better than just a slave of another people. In the 3rd verse, it says, if he came in by himself, then he shall go out by himself. If he was married, then his wife shall go out with him. So if he came in by himself and then goes out. If he was already married when he became a servant or a slave, then he and his wife have to be allowed to leave. But, 4th verse, if his master gave him his wife, and she bore him sons and daughters, the wife and her children shall be the master's, and he shall go out by himself. So at the end of that period of service, if while he was a slave there, the master gave him his wife, then she still belongs to him. He can leave, but she and the children are still his property. If the servant shall plainly say, and here in Hebrew it says, Yomer Eved Ahavti. So Ahava is love. In Hebrew. Ahavti. I love Adoni. I love my master. Here Adon means Lord. I love my Lord, person that I have. The et ishti, and my wife. The et bini, and my children. Lo et se chafshi. I will not go free. Then if it's his choice to stay, he's given that option, but he doesn't want to leave his master. If it's choice, then you have to put a hole in his ear. It says, bring him to the door, put this hole in his ear, And presumably, this was so that everybody who sees him knows this man was given the option of being free. And he chose to stay. I'm not forcing him. I didn't bind him. I'm not making him. He chose to stay. And the only reason this is because he loves his master. Now we think back to the book of Genesis. There, the Torah tells us about Abraham's servants or slaves, same word, Eved, right? And they loved Abraham. And Abraham can trust his servants. He gives them gold and camels and all of this. He says, go find a wife for my son Isaac. That slave could have took off and never came back with all of that gold. But he says, he was like my family. He was a part of my house. And when Abraham circumcised himself and his sons, he said, I circumcised my whole household, even though they weren't Hebrews in this sense. They were like family. So if you are, we can imagine a circumstance, if you are a good master, not abusing your slaves, I'm going to get the examples of abuse in a moment, and you treat them like family, and you treat them fairly, then they may choose to stay. And that puts it in a kind of different context from one where you have force, where people are being chained, where people are being captured. The other thing I would say, in putting it into biblical context, is if you buy, who are you buying the slave from? And the context here is that people are selling themselves. There are no slave markets, we know historically, in the land of Israel. You didn't go buy, auction, buy the slaves that way. People would sell themselves, and so it is a transaction. I will work for you. In exchange, you will provide shelter, food, clothing for a period of time. And so in that sense, if you think of it as a barter system, this person is selling, I agree to work with you, but putting a limit on it, the 7-year limit. To say at that time, you have to let the slave go free. This makes it not a lifelong, nor generational status that can be passed on from one generation to the next. I'm going to skip down in the interest of time, where it talks about other forms of service and treatment. But when we get down to the 23rd verse, we get this passage that's often misunderstood in the Torah, where it talks about Mishpatim, judgment, and that the judgment should be fair and just. And it says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, and a foot for a foot. Does this permit revenge in any way? I'm going to go for eye for an eye. Whatever was done to me, I'll do to someone else. What the Torah is trying to teach us here is that the punishment should always fit the crime. You shouldn't take someone's life for a small offense. Let the punishment fit the crime. An eye for an eye, not a life for a life. Not a life for an eye. Right? We talk about other examples where people get into fights and different things, and if there's damages, it says, well, it should be proportional. This would be justice. Right? Now, if you have a society in the world we see in our system where people, on Wall Street, if they're ever caught or prosecuted, so millions of dollars, and they get life sentences, and then a person who steals a car, serving many years in jail, that wouldn't be proportional in terms of the crime doesn't fit the punishment. And everyone isn't given the same punishment for the same crime. So it's trying to make it proportional. Now, during the term of service, whether it is a Hebrew or a foreigner, I like this point that's very important, and I'm going to make a distinction to American slavery and slavery in the Caribbean and other places. It says, if a man strike the eye of his servant, or Eved, his slave, and the eye of his maid is destroyed, he shall let the man go free for the sake of the eye. If he strikes out his tooth, servant's tooth, he shall let him go free for the sake of that tooth. So there are limits to what you can do to your slave or your servant. They have to work for you. You could discipline them, but there's a limit to discipline. If you cause any permanent bodily injury, you have to let that person go. If you so much as knock out their tooth, right, then that would be considered abuse. That would invalidate your right to have that person working for you, and you have to let that person go, even if they were in the first year of their service, or if they were not a Hebrew slave or servant, you have to let them go. So you can't keep and abuse people. Okay? Now let me compare this to slavery in other places, particularly here in the United States. This year, many of us are celebrating and recognizing the 400th anniversary of African Americans' presence in this country. The first slaves, they say, arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in the year 1619. And so this year, 2019, is very important and significant for us in terms of how long our people have been in this country. It also coincides with our 100th anniversary, the centennial of Israelites having congregations. Remember, Matthews established the first congregation in Harlem in 1919. 1619, first Africans arrived here in the United States. But this is what many people don't know about those first people who arrived here in the United States. Many of those Africans came from Africa, came to the United States by way of Barbados. Ship was captured and arrived in Jamestown. Many of them arrived in Jamestown, and many of them in those first decades in the United States were set free. They were able to get their own land. They were able to then assimilate into society in Virginia. And this is because Virginia has the first of 13 colonies. When it was established, the English were hoping to find gold like the Spanish in South America. When they didn't find any gold, they said, well, there's no gold here. Is there anything else of value? And they began to produce tobacco. Pocahontas and John Rolfe, you know the whole story. And it was very labor intensive. They said, who are we going to get to grow this tobacco? And they were bringing people over from Europe, and they were called indentured servants. Indentured servants, meaning somebody else paid their passage, and in exchange for that passage, you would have to work for them for a period of time that could be as little as 3 years, and get this, as long as 7. And this seems to be related almost like to the Torah. Why is 7 years considered like the limit of legal servitude, and how long a person has to work for you before they could be set free? And so they were doing this kind of indentured service. And as little as it's known, many of the early Europeans were treating the Africans like indentured servants. And they would work them and then set them free, and they would get their land. I use one example in my history course of the records we have of one person. His name was Anthony Johnson, and he was from Angola. Now we know his name wasn't Anthony in Angola.
My ancestor come from Angola.
So they were from Angola,
yeah.
right? So his name wasn't Anthony in Angola, but he came to America as one of these indentured servants. He got his own land. And he is found in the records of Virginia of owning 250 acres of land in Virginia in the 1600s. He had white and black indentured servants working for him. And then he shows up in the legal court records again. And skin is court stenographer. He's being sued by one of his indentured servants. His name is Kesor in the records, who wants his freedom. And Anthony Johnson is not giving it to him. He says, I've been working for you for whatever the time was, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. I want to be free now. And Anthony Johnson is not letting him free. And it goes to court. And Anthony Johnson says, when I purchased Kesor, I didn't purchase him as an indentured servant. I purchased him to be a slave for life. And I use this case because, as I said, he is a black man himself. and he's owning another black man. He doesn't want him free. But he is in this time when they begin to change and they're not letting their Africans go free. They're trying to keep them for life. In the beginning, they will let them free. And some of them, once they got free, would get their land and get other people. And then they would let them free, and then they stop freeing them. And you see gradually over time. The other example I'm connecting with Torah is there's another case involving an African-American man named Jonathan Punch. That was his name, Punch. He was one of these indentured servants. He ran away with with two other white indentured servants, and they were all caught. They were all whipped. You could whip and beat the white indentured servants as well, right? And for the white ones, they have additional years added to their sentence. So if they were supposed to work 3 years, because you ran away before your contract was up, you got to do 5 years. But for Jonathan Punch, his punishment is he's going to be an indentured servant for the rest of his life. That's the definition of being a slave. And then through the late 1600s and early 1700s, you have other cases come up. One of a master, once they're slaves for life, they have no risk now of running away. Right? If I succeed, I'm free. If I get caught, they're just going to bring me back to the plantation. But it can't get any worse. It can't be like more years added. So this is an incentive to try to run away. You have nothing to lose. Right? If you escape, you're free. If they catch you, you bring it back, but you're going to stay on the plantation for the rest of your life anyway. So what they began doing is cutting off the toes of runaway slaves here in the United States. Now this is why I said the book of Exodus 21st chapter 27th verse says you cannot cause any permanent bodily injury to your slave. If you knock out an eye, you knock out a tooth, you can discipline them, but if you smack them or you punch them and you cause any permanent bodily injury, what does the Torah say? You must let them go. You must let them go. So in the 1600s, when they started doing things like cutting off the toes of slaves, you could not do that in Torah. You could make people work, you could have people working for you, but once you injure them even in the slightest permanent way, that causes a permanent, so this would be a whipping that leaves a permanent mark, or tooth or eye, then that would be going too far. Finally, my last example with this in terms of comparison, how slavery in America was different from slavery in the Torah, is that in the early 1700s, you have a case of a master who was whipping his slave, beating his slave, and the slave died. And it became a legal question, would the man be charged with murder under the law? Because even if it were an accident, right? But he was whipping him, he was beating him, maybe he went too far, but he killed him. And the decision was that there would be no charge. They are property now, and you can do whatever you want with your property, even to the point of murder, right? And so this is different from what the Torah teaches us. Now, why did I say judgments are eternal? Is what we see happening in America is very much like what the Israelites did. They themselves were slaves, just like Anthony Johnson. He came to America. When he got off that boat in Virginia, they purchased him. They could have owned him for the rest of his life, but they treated him like an indentured servant, and at the end of 7 years, they let him go free. And then he started to become successful. And then he had indentured servants, and now the person who was once a slave doesn't want to free his slave. What did the children of Israel do? We were slaves in Egypt for over 400 years, and they were not going to let us go. We were slaves for life. We were slaves from generations. From the time of Joseph to the time of Moses, we were there as slaves. They weren't going to let us go, and God brought us out. You would think we would be grateful. You would think we would understand, and we wouldn't treat other people the way we were treated. But we get into the land. This is why the laws, you still a slave, but we're on our way to Israel. When we get there, God says, I will send angels before you. Right? And little by little, you will come to possess that land. And then there'll become a time now where you might. He says, remember, we were once slaves in Egypt, so we're supposed to empathize. We're least supposed to sympathize, at least supposed to know what it's like. But we did not. And this is from the Haftarah, the book of Jeremiah, that Shekinah read so well today. And this is why the passage from Jeremiah is connected with this passage from Exodus. Because it's a warning. When you get to become free, and if you ever get in a position of power or authority over other people, don't abuse that. There are limits in terms of how you have to treat people. But it says in the book of Jeremiah, the 34th chapter, the 8th verse, this is the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah from the Lord after King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people who were in Jerusalem to proclaim liberty to them. So this had to be one of those years of Jubilee. Every 7 years, you have to let the slaves go. And every 50 years, right, the year of Jubilee, everything returns to its original position. All the land, as it was divided by Moses among the 12 tribes, everybody gets their land back. Everybody is freed of their debt. Everybody is released from prison. This is supposed to be a year of Jubilee, right? So that you start over. So King Zedekiah proclaimed this year of liberty, of freedom, that every man should be set free, his male and female servants, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, that no one should keep his Hebrew brother in bondage. Now when all the princes and all the people that entered the covenant heard that everyone was to be set free, his male and female servants, that no one should keep them in bondage anymore, they obeyed and let them go. Then in the 11th verse it says, but afterwards they changed their mind. 11th verse. They set them free. I'm proclaiming it. This is the 7th year. You got to let the people go at the end of 7 years. And proclaim Jubilee. Everybody gets their land back. Everybody's free of their debts. Right? Everything gets to start over again. Right? And so they did that. And then they changed their minds. And they made the male and female slaves return, whom they had set free, and brought them into subjugation as male and female slaves. 17th verse. Therefore, says the Lord, you have not obeyed me in proclaiming liberty, everyone to his brother and everyone to his neighbor. Behold, I proclaim liberty, says the Lord, to the sword, to pestilence, and to famine, and I will deliver you to trouble among all the kings of the earth. And I will give the men who have transgressed my covenant, who have not performed the word of the covenant which they made before me, when they cut the calf in two and passed it between its parts, then the princes of Judah and the princes of Jerusalem, the eunuchs and the priests, and I will give them into the hand of their enemies, and into the hand of those who seek their life. Their dead bodies shall be meat for the birds of heaven and the beasts of the earth. And so the judgment of we will go into slavery again is because when we did our power, we didn't set those people free the way the Torah commands in the book of Exodus. We set them free and then we changed our minds. So what we have to do our own work now. We're going to give up our power. We're going to give up our privilege. And they re-enslaved them. And the prophet Jeremiah prophesies, because of this, you will become slaves again. Just like you were once slaves to Egypt. And he was predicting first the Assyrian exile in 722. Then the Babylonian exile. Then the Romans and the Greeks. And then we would say even the transatlantic slave trade that brought our ancestors from Africa to America is fulfillment of this scripture. This is why you're going to go back into slavery. Just this is the law of karma. What you did will come back to you. And you enslaved people, you didn't set them free, then you're going to wind up being slaves again. And so for us, particularly this passage of Torah means a lot to us as African Americans, as Hebrew Israelites, because it describes a process, a predicament that we are living today and that we think about in 2019 that 400 years ago we came here as slaves because when we were masters, we didn't treat people properly. And it's a warning to Americans, other countries who have long histories of slavery, that what you have done comes back. Many of us, see what's going on in the world today, and we see this cycle, and this is why Hashem chose Israel as an example, but it's a universal message to all people everywhere of how you treat people, and what you do comes back upon you and your descendants eventually. As it says in the book of Ecclesiastes, in the last chapter, in the last verse of that book, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every work into judgment concerning every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. Shabbat shalom,
Shabbat shalom.
And shalom aleichem.